10 years ago at my own engagement party, I caught my sister in a hotel hallway, her hand on my billionaire fiancé's chest, smiling like she had finally beaten me. Within a week, the wedding was gone. My family told me to stay quiet, and I disappeared in shame. I rebuilt alone, built a company, and married a man who chose me for my strength. And when fate placed us all in the same ballroom again, the look on my sister's face when she realized who my husband was made every year of silence worth it. I was 25 when I believed my life had finally reached the point I had dreamed of. I was engaged to Richard Hale, a man of 42, who had made his fortune in real estate from Dallas to Denver. He was older, confident, and powerful in a way that made my family feel secure. To them, Richard was not only my fiancé, he was the family's entry into a circle of prestige they had never touched. That summer evening, the engagement party glowed under crystal chandeliers at a downtown Dallas hotel. My mother drifted across the ballroom with a polished smile, pearls catching the light, greeting guests as if she were hosting royalty. My father stood proud near the bar, shaking hands with bankers and investors. I moved among them in a pale blue silk dress that brushed my ankles, feeling for once that the spotlight was on me and not on my sister Elena. She was 2 years older, always the glamorous one, but this night was supposed to be mine. I smiled until my face ached, thanking strangers for their congratulations, listening to stories about Richard's latest deal, and pretending to be comfortable in a world that never fully felt like mine. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe I had stepped out of Elena's shadow. The ring on my hand sparkled under the lights, and I thought perhaps the years of being overlooked were finally behind me. It was close to midnight when I noticed Richard and Elena were both missing. I had last seen them laughing near the bar. My stomach tightened, though I told myself they must have stepped outside. I slipped away from a group of guests and walked into the quiet hallway. A cousin intercepted me, her face pale. She pressed her phone into my hand. On the screen was a blurry photo taken quickly, but the image was clear enough. Richard leaning down toward Elena, her hand on his chest, their faces far too close in the dim light of a side corridor. My cousin whispered that I should see for myself, then hurried away. The floor seemed to tilt under me. I pushed forward, my heels clicking against the marble as I turned the corner. There they were no longer embracing, but standing much too near. Richard straightened as if nothing were wrong. Elena tilted her chin with that small, deliberate smile that had cut me since childhood. I asked what was going on. My voice cracked, but I forced it steady. Richard's tone was calm, almost dismissive. "Business and emotions get complicated, Clara. You are young. One day you will understand." His words felt like ice poured into my veins. Elena said nothing, only let her smile widen before she looked away. I walked back into the ballroom, numb. The music still played champagne, still flowed the chatter of guests, carried on, as if my world had not just broken apart. My mother saw me and hurried over, still smiling for the crowd. She gripped my arm hard enough to hurt and hissed that I must not embarrass the family. "Think about our reputation," she said. "Do not ruin this night." Her words told me she had known, or at least that she cared more about appearances than the truth. I let the glass in my hand slip slightly, catching it before it fell, my knuckles white. I looked around the room at the faces, laughing, unaware, or perhaps choosing not to see. My father glanced at me once and looked back at his drink. Elena returned later, her dress flawless, her hair untouched as if nothing had happened at all. Within the week, the engagement was over. Richard sent a message through his assistant that the match was not suitable after all. The newspapers wrote of irreconcilable differences, nothing of betrayal. At home, my mother told me I had embarrassed everyone. My father folded his paper and said nothing. Elena remained silent, her calm mask never slipping. I packed my things in Denver with shaking hands. The ring sat cold in its velvet box until I left it on the counter for Richard's driver to collect. By the end of that summer, I was no longer anyone's fiancée, not even the favored daughter. I was only Clara, carrying the hollow that betrayal carved inside me. I thought that night was the end, but it was only the beginning. What I did not know then was that this fall would set the fire for the next 10 years, and that the sister who once smiled in silence would one day have to face me again, not alone, but with the man who chose to stand at my side. The years that followed felt like walking through fog with no one waiting on the other side. I left Dallas behind and returned to Denver with nothing but a suitcase, a few savings, and the weight of a scandal no one wanted to speak about. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment near Capitol Hill and threw myself into work. By day, I juggled temp jobs to keep the lights on, and by night, I studied for my MBA at the University of Denver. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford, but exhaustion was easier than silence. Meanwhile, my mother and Elena continued to live as if nothing had happened. Their photos appeared on social pages, attending charity luncheons and gallery openings. Elena wore new gowns, smiling easily, her name whispered alongside men of influence. At Thanksgiving dinners, she was seated at the center of the table, while I found myself at the end, half hidden behind the centerpiece, my words drowned out by her laughter. In Christmas cards sent to colleagues and friends, the family posed in coordinated sweaters before the fireplace. My name was not printed, my face never included. I learned to stop expecting invitations. When I did show up, I was treated as a guest in a house where I had grown up. My mother would pat my hand politely and say, "Elena has always been the future of this family. Clara, you were always meant for quieter things." I never argued. I swallowed the words that burned in my chest and carried them back to my apartment where unpaid bills piled next to textbooks. Still, I pushed forward. I took every consulting project I could find, built relationships with professors who believed in my ideas, and started sketching plans for a healthcare startup that could provide affordable telemedicine in rural Colorado. It was small, clumsy, and underfunded, but it was mine. For the first time, I built something without needing the approval of anyone who had dismissed me. In 2015, my grandmother Rose passed away. She had been the only one who ever saw me without comparison. At the reading of her will, I sat quietly expecting nothing more than condolences. The lawyer spoke in a measured tone, listing property and accounts that passed to my mother and Elena. I remember watching them nod as if all of it was inevitable. Then, tucked into the papers, I noticed a line that seemed to vanish as soon as it was read. 15% of Hale Investments left to me, her second granddaughter. My mother's hand moved quickly, covering the document, her voice sharp as she told the lawyer we would discuss details privately. I caught his glance, brief but knowing. Later, when I asked for clarification, my mother dismissed it with a cold smile. There was a mistake, she said, nothing I should trouble myself with. But I had seen the stamp, the signature, the date. I went home that night and wrote it all down, hiding the notes inside a box under my bed. I did not have the power to fight them then, but I understood the value of patience. The following years hardened me. I graduated with my MBA in 2016, launched my startup from a cramped co-working space in Lodo, and survived on black coffee and sheer will. Some months I could not pay myself, but the platform grew slowly, one clinic at a time. My body ached from the long hours, yet my spirit stayed lit by something stronger than ambition. Every slight, every erasure, every family photo without me fueled the determination not to vanish. At rare family gatherings, I was still the afterthought. Elena swept in wearing designer coats, announcing her latest travels or acquaintances. My mother listened with shining eyes, then turned to me only to ask if my little project was still running. I smiled tightly and said yes. Inside, I reminded myself that they would never hand me recognition. I would have to take it in my own way. By 2018, the startup had secured a small grant from the state. It was not wealth, but it was survival, and for the first time in years, I felt stable. I no longer cried when I walked back into my apartment at night. I no longer felt small in every room. Instead, I carried the quiet knowledge of the papers hidden in my box, the truth of my grandmother's gift, and the certainty that my story was not over. I told myself that one day the silence would break, and when it did, Elena would not be smiling in the shadows, because I would be the one holding the light. In the spring of 2019, I stood in a small chapel on the edge of Denver's Washington Park, wearing a simple white dress that brushed the floor. The room smelled faintly of lilies and wood polish, and sunlight streamed through tall windows onto the polished pews. There were no flashing cameras, no long guest lists, no society columns, just a handful of close friends, a few colleagues from the startup, and Michael Carter waiting at the altar with a calm smile that steadied me. He was 40, a partner at a respected law firm, steady, where I was restless, and in his eyes, I felt safe. The ceremony was quiet and unpretentious. My mother had declined to attend, saying she was unwell. Elena sent no message at all. As I walked down the aisle to Michael, I did not look for them. I focused on the man in front of me who took my hands gently and whispered that everything we had endured brought us to this moment. When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, I felt something I had not felt in years, a sense of belonging that was not tied to wealth or approval, but to trust. Our reception was held at a small restaurant on Colfax Avenue. We ordered local wine, shared plates of roasted vegetables and grilled salmon, and laughed until our sides hurt. There was no orchestra, just a local jazz trio playing softly in the corner. At one point, Michael raised his glass and told everyone that strength is not only surviving betrayal, but choosing love afterward. My eyes blurred, not from sadness, but because I finally believed him. Marriage did not soften my drive. Michael encouraged me to expand the healthcare tech startup I had been building piece by piece. He sat with me late at night as I drafted grant proposals, reviewed contracts, and refined business plans. His background in law became a shield protecting me from predatory investors and contracts filled with traps. By the end of 2019, we secured a federal grant aimed at expanding telemedicine access in rural Colorado. The company was still small, but now clinics across 3 counties used our platform. For the first time, I saw our logo on brochures in doctors' offices, and it made the sleepless years feel worth it. Meanwhile, Elena's carefully curated image began to crack. Relationships she flaunted on social media ended quickly, often with quiet scandals trailing behind them. She moved back into my mother's home in Highland Park, living on my mother's checks and the remnants of her once glamorous wardrobe. Yet in society, photos she still appeared with a practiced smile, arm-linked with acquaintances of influence wearing borrowed jewelry. To outsiders, she was still a socialite. To me, she looked increasingly hollow. Michael and I rarely spoke about Elena, but sometimes at night he would glance at me when her name appeared in a magazine or in a careless family update. He would remind me gently that her choices did not define mine. Still, I kept a quiet record of her missteps, not out of obsession, but because I knew one day the truth would matter. That fall, as our lives settled into a rhythm, Michael brought up the topic of a prenuptial agreement, not because he doubted me, but because he wanted us both to feel secure. I had lived through what happened when trust collided with betrayal. This time, I was not going to leave myself exposed. We sat across from each other at our kitchen table, legal papers spread out, and agreed line by line. Every asset, every account, every clause was laid bare. We promised transparency, promised fairness, promised that no matter what the future held, neither of us would face the kind of ruin I had endured before. When I signed the final page, I felt a calm settle over me. The mistakes of my past would not repeat. I looked at Michael across the table and realized he was not only my husband, but my partner in every sense. He kissed my hand and told me that strength is not just building walls, it is knowing where the doors should be. By the end of that year, our company had doubled its clients, and journalists started to call for interviews. I declined most, preferring to work quietly, but I knew the tide was turning. For the first time in a decade, my name began to carry weight, not because of who I had lost, but because of what I had built. Still in the back of my mind, I felt the pull of the past. Elena and my mother had hidden too much for too long. The diurnal rhythm of married life and business growth could not erase the knowledge of the will my grandmother had left tucked away and ignored. The papers remained in my box waiting, and I knew the day would come when silence could no longer protect them. In the spring of 2023, an invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope with gold lettering across the front. It was for a charity gala at the Brown Palace Hotel in downtown Denver, one of those black tie events where politicians, business leaders, and socialites rubbed shoulders for photographs under chandeliers. My first instinct was to decline. I had spent years building my company quietly focusing on clinics and patients rather than champagne toasts. But Michael encouraged me to go. He said sometimes presence is power. When the night came, I walked through the revolving doors in a dark emerald gown and felt every head turn. The years had hardened me, but also refined me. I was no longer the woman erased from family photographs or seated at the end of the table. My company had expanded to cover 7 counties, federal funding had tripled, and a national health magazine had just run a feature on our telemedicine platform. As I handed my coat to the attendant, I saw flashes of recognition in the eyes of people I had never met. Inside the ballroom gleamed with crystal light, and music floated from a live orchestra. Servers carried trays of champagne and canapes. And then I saw them. My mother in silver satin pearls glinting standing with Elena, who wore a backless gown the color of wine. Their laughter carried above the hum of conversation perfectly rehearsed. For a moment the old ache stirred, but it faded when I realized I no longer walked in as their forgotten daughter or overlooked sister. I was invited for my own name. Not long after I entered, a photographer asked for a shot. I stood in front of a banner printed with logos of sponsors smiling as cameras clicked. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Elena watching. Her smile faltered only slightly, but enough for me to see the envy behind it. A reporter stepped closer and began asking about our expansion. I answered calmly, careful yet confident, while Elena drifted to the side pretending not to listen. Later in the evening, as I sipped a glass of sparkling water near the silent auction tables, a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook approached me. She introduced herself as Phoebe Lane, a columnist for the Denver Journal, known for social coverage. She congratulated me on the company's growth, then leaned in just enough for her words to reach only my ears. She said she had heard rumors years ago that my sister Elena was the reason a prominent engagement in Dallas had collapsed. She asked if there was any truth. My heart jolted, but I kept my face still. I told her politely that I had nothing to add to old rumors and redirected her to my work with rural health care. She nodded, scribbled something in her notebook, and thanked me. I stood very still after she left, realizing that the past I thought buried was still alive in whispers. Toward the end of the evening, I stepped out into the foyer to breathe. The air smelled of polished wood and roses. That was when Cousin Maggie appeared, clutching her small clutch bag tightly. She pulled me aside, her eyes nervous but determined. She slipped an envelope into my hand and whispered that I should keep it safe. I looked down. It was old edges yellowed, stamped with the seal of a law office I recognized from my grandmother Rose's estate. At home later that night, I opened it. Inside was a notarized document from 2015, confirming my grandmother's transfer of 15% of Hale Investments into my name. The stamp was clear, the signatures precise. I stared at it, breath shallow, remembering the way my mother had brushed it aside at the will reading. I now held undeniable proof. I placed the papers carefully back into the envelope and locked it in the small safe at the back of my closet. For years I had carried the memory of being erased. Now I carried a weapon my family had tried to hide. As I turned off the light, I thought of Elena's eyes following me at the gala. The reporter's whispered question, the envelope now sealed inside my safe. I knew the quiet balance could not last forever. The past was pressing forward, and the stage for confrontation was already being set. The invitation for the Denver Business Forum arrived in January 2024, embossed with navy lettering and a seal that signified influence. Michael read it over my shoulder and smiled, saying it was the kind of event where reputations were cemented. I had learned to keep my composure in such rooms, but the thought of walking into a crowd that included my family sent a current through me. On the evening of the forum, we walked into the downtown convention center, where glass walls reflected the city lights. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns spoke in clusters, wine glasses raised like shields. Michael placed a steady hand at my back, reminding me without words that I was not alone. I spotted my mother and Elena near the main stage, both dressed as if they had been waiting for a spotlight. My mother wore her pearls again, the same ones she had at my engagement party all those years ago. Elena was in a gold gown, laughing too loudly at something a banker said. They looked polished, but the sharpness in my mother's eyes gave her away. She noticed me almost instantly, her smile tightening before she leaned in to whisper something to Elena. Not long after, I saw a tall figure cross the room and felt my breath catch. Richard Hale walked in with his new wife at his side, a woman perhaps in her early 30s, elegant and calm. They passed within feet of Elena. He did not look at her, not even a flicker of recognition. The way Elena's jaw clenched told me everything. The man she had betrayed me for had erased her as easily as brushing lint from a sleeve. I stayed still watching, but said nothing. Michael leaned close and asked if I was all right. I nodded, eyes fixed on the way Elena masked her anger with a brittle laugh. It was a quiet satisfaction not born from vengeance, but from clarity. The evening continued with speeches about investment in the region. Michael and I mingled, answering questions about the expansion of our healthcare platform. A few executives asked for my card. Some remembered the federal grant we had received. My answers were careful but confident. I knew Elena was watching from across the room, the smile never leaving her lips, though her eyes grew tighter each time another hand reached for mine. Later, during the networking hour, my mother approached a group near the bar with Elena at her side. I stood just a few steps away, listening. With a gleam of pride, she introduced Elena as the family's true star, the daughter who carried their legacy forward. She spoke of Elena's connections, her poise, her presence in high society. My name was not mentioned. It was as if I were a stranger at my own family's gathering. Before the sting could settle, one of the investors in the circle glanced past them and spotted me. He excused himself from their conversation and walked straight toward me, shaking my hand firmly. He congratulated me on the measurable success of my startup, said his firm had been following our progress, and admired the scale of our telemedicine network. His words were loud enough to carry back to where my mother and Elena stood. I thanked him calmly, aware of the weight of their eyes on me. When he handed me his card and said he hoped we could meet soon to discuss partnerships, I felt the air shift. Elena's laugh faltered, my mother's expression stiffened, and for once the room did not orbit around them. Michael slipped his arm through mine as the investor left, his voice low with pride. "That was all you, Clara." I smiled, but I did not look back at my mother or my sister. I knew they were watching, and I knew this was only the beginning. As the evening closed and the crowd began to disperse, the silence between us stretched like a wire waiting to snap. I could feel it in the way my mother avoided my eyes, in the way Elena's smile was painted too perfectly on her face. I had walked into the room steady, and I would leave steady, but I understood something important. The real confrontation was still ahead, and none of us would walk away unchanged. Elena cornered me near the silent auction tables, her glass of champagne tilted lazily in her hand. Her voice was sweet enough for those standing nearby, but her words were aimed like knives. She said it must be strange for me to stand here now after being abandoned by a billionaire a decade ago, a woman left behind while the world moved forward. Her smile was bright, her eyes daring me to falter. The hum of conversation dipped, a few heads turning toward us. My pulse quickened, but before I opened my mouth, Michael stepped in. He placed himself at my side and faced Elena directly. His voice carried firm, but not raised. "I know the past," he said, "every part of it. But I chose Clara, because she is strong and decent. No one, not even her own family, has the right to diminish her in public or in private." The silence broke into a murmur. People leaned closer, whispers ran like electricity through the crowd. Elena froze, her painted smile cracking as she tried to gather herself. She had expected me to shrink, not for my husband to draw a line in front of everyone. My mother approached quickly, her hand on Elena's arm. Her voice clipped as she told her to move on, but the damage was already spreading. Before I could catch my breath, phones began buzzing. Screens lit up across the ballroom. A notification banner ran across Michael's own phone, which he turned toward me. An article had just gone live. The headline carried Phoebe Lane's name, bold and precise. It detailed not only whispers of betrayal from years ago, but also the existence of my grandmother Rose's will, leaving me 15% of Hale Investments, a fact that had been hidden. Gasps rippled through the room as people read. Some turned to look at me, others at my mother and Elena. My mother's face drained of color, her pearls suddenly looking like a chain around her neck. Elena sputtered, insisting the article was fabricated, that no such inheritance existed. But Phoebe had included a scanned copy of the notarized page, the seal clear, the date irrefutable. The tension cracked into open stares. A banker nearby whispered loudly enough to be heard that hiding an estate document was fraud. Another guest muttered that it explained everything, the years of silence, the erasure. My mother tried to speak, saying the matter was complicated family business, but her words fell flat in the heavy air. Elena's hand trembled as she set down her glass, her voice sharper now. She accused me of leaking the information, of conspiring with the press to humiliate them. I stood steady, letting the weight of the truth speak for itself. Michael answered for me, reminding her calmly that if the truth humiliates, it is because of what was done, not who revealed it. A woman I had never met leaned toward me, congratulating me in front of everyone for standing tall after years of being overlooked. The comment was genuine, but also carried the sting of exposure for my mother and sister. They stood cornered, unable to deny, unable to control the narrative any longer. I watched Elena search for a way out, her mask crumbling. My mother's grip on her arm tightened as if holding her upright. The ballroom was no longer a stage for their performance. It had turned into a court, and the verdict was already being written in whispers and phone screens. As Michael guided me toward the exit, the music had stopped and the conversation swelled around us. My chest was tight but steady. For the first time in 10 years, the silence was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them, heavy and choking. I knew then that this was not the end. Documents could shift power, but consequences were only beginning to unfold. The night had cracked the facade, and by morning, nothing in our family would remain untouched. By dawn, the calls began. Reporters wanted comment, board members demanded explanations, and my mother's phone lit up with numbers she no longer recognized. I let the noise wash past me and drove instead to the office of Vincent Gray, the attorney I had quietly contacted months earlier. His office sat in a modest brick building off Spear Boulevard, nothing like the glass towers downtown, but inside his shelves were lined with decades of estate law. Vincent adjusted his glasses and spread the documents across the table. The copy from my grandmother's will, the notarized seal, the confirmation from the courthouse records. He tapped the page with a steady finger and said plainly that the inheritance was valid, binding, and enforceable. 15% of Hale Investments belonged to me, and the family had deliberately suppressed it. I felt my throat tighten as he continued. They cannot undo this, Clara. They can fight in court, but the paper is stronger than their denial. If you choose to pursue, you will have standing to review every account and every transaction they have hidden. I nodded slowly, realizing that the years of being erased had finally reached their end. By the following week, the board of Hale Investments called an emergency meeting. I walked into the conference room in a navy dress and heels that clicked against the tile. Michael walked beside me, his calm presence grounding me as eyes turned from every side of the polished table. My mother sat near the head, her pearl necklace tight around her throat, Elena beside her, pale but defiant. Vincent presented the documents with clinical precision. He outlined my legal claim, the percentage of stock transferred by my grandmother, and the fact that the will had been hidden. The directors whispered among themselves, shock and calculation in their faces. One asked directly why the transfer had never been honored. My mother cleared her throat and spoke of misunderstandings, of old paperwork, of confusion in the estate. Her words sounded thin in the sterile air. The chairman finally said the matter was not about confusion, but compliance. The law required recognition, and the company would honor the shares effective immediately. I signed my name to the register, my pen steady, and for the first time, Hale Investments had to acknowledge me not as a shadow, but as a stakeholder. The impact was immediate. With my portion restored, the balance of control shifted. My mother and Elena lost their unchecked influence. Transactions were frozen, accounts reviewed, and the image of stability they had clung to unraveled in front of Denver's business community. Articles ran in local papers about betrayal inside one of the city's prominent families. Former allies kept their distance. Invitations to luncheons vanished. Elena confronted me outside the boardroom one afternoon. Her voice was sharp, her hands trembling. "You think this makes you stronger than me?" she hissed. "But you are nothing without this paper." Michael stepped forward, then his tone calm but unyielding. "It is not paper that defines her, it is the truth. And the truth is not on your side." She faltered under his gaze, her defiance shrinking into silence. For the first time, Elena dropped her eyes, unable to meet his. It was not my anger that forced her down, but the weight of consequence. She had once stolen with a smile, but now she could not even hold her head up. As weeks passed, the company reeled from audits and fractured trust. My mother withdrew from public view, her name whispered not with admiration, but with suspicion. Elena lingered in her house, no longer courted by the men she once paraded, her image cracked beyond repair. I did not gloat. I did not need to. Watching Elena bow her head before Michael was enough. Justice had not shouted, it had simply stood steady until the lies collapsed. And yet deep inside, I sensed the story was not complete. Power taken from those who cling to it rarely disappears quietly. Something told me their silence was only temporary, and the final reckoning had not yet arrived. In the months that followed, I found myself breathing differently, as if a weight I had carried for years had finally lifted. I no longer walked into rooms wondering if I would be erased. People called me by name, not as Elena's sister, not as Margaret's daughter, but as Clara Bennett, CEO of a company that was changing healthcare in Colorado. Invitations came from universities, from conferences, from organizations that had once overlooked me. I accepted only a few, not for the spotlight, but to remind myself that recognition felt different when it was earned rather than granted. At home, life settled into a rhythm I had once believed impossible. Michael and I shared quiet dinners on our back porch, the city lights of Denver glimmering in the distance. We spoke of the future with ease, no longer shadowed by what had been stolen. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a kind of pride I could not put into words. He reminded me gently that I had not just survived betrayal, but had built something out of it. Elena's world shrank in contrast. She stayed mostly indoors at my mother's house, the same walls she had once left behind in search of grandeur. Her social calendar emptied the friends who once clung to her name, disappearing when the scandal grew heavy. I heard whispers that she rarely left her room, that she scrolled through old photographs of galas and trips trying to relive the days when she believed she had won. When I saw her once passing through a quiet cafe near Cherry Creek, her shoulders were hunched, her eyes avoiding mine. The gold that once surrounded her had dulled to dust. My mother's name no longer appeared in charity columns. The pearls she wore like armor could not protect her from the reputation that now followed her. People in Denver's business community remembered her not for her elegance, but for deception. The empire she had tried to curate around Elena had collapsed, leaving only questions and silence. I did not rejoice in their downfall. Karma worked without my hands. What I did feel was a kind of steady justice, the kind that does not shout, but hums like a quiet current beneath the surface. Every time I looked at the safe in my closet, where my grandmother's documents now rested in order, I felt her presence. She had seen me for who I was, and even after her passing, she had given me the chance to reclaim what was mine. 10 years earlier, I had been left at the edge of a ballroom, shamed and discarded. 10 years later, I stood in front of the same city with my husband beside me and the law on my side. The arc of it all was not loud or theatrical. It was deliberate, patient, and undeniable. One evening in late autumn, I stood at the window of our home, the leaves turning red along the streets. I thought of the girl I had been at 25, watching her world collapse. I wished I could reach her, tell her not to surrender to silence, that the same silence would one day break on its own. Justice does not always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when the truth is finally undeniable, when lies can no longer hold. I learned that strength is not in shouting, but in standing steady until the noise falls away. If you were in my place, would you forgive the sister who once shattered your life? Or would you let silence remain the final word,